morning. On behalf of our pastor, the Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley, and the Christian Life Institute, we want to welcome you to our January Bible study program. Every year during the month of January, we don't have our regular Tuesday night Bible study, but we set aside a few Saturdays in January so that we can have opportunity for more in-depth study and invite folks who can't always come out on a Tuesday night. And we are delighted to have the Reverend Dr. Michael Eric Dyson with us this morning. I'd like to ask the board of the Christian Life Institute to stand so that we can acknowledge them. They've done wonderful work in putting this program together. Would you all please stand? I am delighted to present to you all the Reverend Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. When I teach the section in Hebrew Bible that covers the prophets, one of the first things I say to my students is that a prophet is not someone who speaks towards the future. A prophet is not a foreteller. A prophet is a forth-teller. A prophet speaks truth to the reality where the community lives. And that's a very uncomfortable position to occupy. Anybody who's called to be a prophet, if they have any sense, should run in the opposite direction. But we are grateful that the prophetic voice exists in our time and culture in the person of Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. He is professor of sociology at Georgetown University and received his PhD in religious studies from Princeton University and his undergraduate degree from Carson Newman University. He won the American Book Award in 2007 for his book Come Hell or High Water and has won numerous honors and accolades. I think that most of you have had opportunity to see him in his position of political analyst on MSNBC, or perhaps you've seen him on Talk of the Nation. But for all of the things that he's accomplished, don't forget that he is a Baptist preacher and a child of God, and we are delighted to have him with us this morning. Please join me in welcoming Michael Eric Dyson.
Thank you, Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams, for that very gracious introduction, a friend of long standing, and to the great Reverend Dr. Professor Howard John Wesley, a remarkable young man, a great pastor, a brilliant preacher, and a stalwart for truth. And the fact that he has such a brilliant and engaged scholar as Dr. Judy here working among the people where her knowledge cannot simply be quarantined to the academy, but shared with everyday folk. And that's a good thing, because a lot of us scholars get stuck up in the academy. Some of us are trapped there, can't get let out for good behavior. And to have her sharing that brilliance and that wisdom with you, you already know is a gift. So let's give her a round of applause, too. And I sneak in and hear your pastor every now and again, you know, incognito. And then I see him when he's out. He's just a remarkable, remarkable spirit. And I'm honored to return here under his invitation and to see the remarkable work that he's doing with this church and combining both the priestly obligation to feed the sheep and the prophetic one to speak the truth, as Dr. Judy has already indicated, the forth-telling, and to be honest about the realities and the conditions, the trials and traumas that we confront. So it's a great honor to be here under his invitation, and he's a remarkable young man and a fellow Beyonce fan. So Maybe if he invites me back next year, I can talk about Beyonce and religion. I would love to do that. First lecture would be, I woke up like this. But as for now, what I want to do in this race and religion series, this first lecture, we want to focus on the civil rights movement, talk a bit about race and religion and its interaction, because a lot of people don't think they belong together, and then talk about Martin Luther King Jr., such a central figure, his official birthday celebration on Monday, January 15th, of course, his actual birthday, to speak about him in the context in this first hour, and then in the second hour, talk about Selma the film and all the controversy and the incredible conversation that has occurred around that remarkable and monumental film that most of you got a chance to see already, right? So y'all ready to talk? Y'all ready? So in the second part, we're going to talk about the making of a movement, but I wanted to talk in this first part about the making of a man. And we're speaking about, of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., born Michael, and for the first 5 years of his life, known as Michael, until his father changed their names to Martin Luther, in recognition of the Protestant reformer. I had him for 5 years in my same name class, then I lost him. But this remarkable young man, born, as you all know, into a family where his father was a preacher, as he was often fond of saying, my dad is a preacher, my granddad is a preacher, my great-granddad is a preacher. He said, I guess I didn't have much choice. His brother, A.D., a preacher as well, Christine Ferris King, his sister, a professor at Spelman College. Dr. King, born in 1929 into a comfortable middle-class family in Atlanta, Georgia, part of the Negro elite. And Dr. King was reared under the tutelage of his loving grandmother and his father and mother in a warm, multi-generational home. At a young age, he escaped from the house, went out for some tomfoolery as a child, came back and discovered that his grandmother had taken ill, and then flung himself from the window in a youthful attempt to end his own life. Now, this young man obviously then is extremely sensitive. And from the very beginning, as he was shaped and molded in the black church, in the bosom of a loving black family, he paid attention to his environment and surroundings. A child of privilege, he would go on as a sensitive child to enter early into Morehouse College at the age of 15. Like Maynard Jackson would a couple of decades later, Martin Luther King Jr. was part of a generation that was being decimated educationally by the Second World War, and as a result of that, it was taking away the numbers of young men going to college. And so Morehouse had an early entrance program for especially gifted and intelligent young students. Martin Luther King Jr. then went to college at 15. The age most people think about what you were doing at 15. Still playing tiddlywinks. Okay, that's old. Maybe you were playing video games, listening to Beyonce, whatever you were doing. Dr. King is 15 in college. I got 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds can't pay attention. 15 in school, they're in college, studying sociology, ran into Dr. Drew, remarkable Christian ethicist, and of course the great Benjamin Elijah Mays, the president of Morehouse College, recipient, I believe, of a PhD from the University of Chicago in religion, a highly intelligent black man. Why is he important? He is important because Martin Luther King Jr. was suspicious of emotional religion. He resisted becoming a minister because his father was one of those get down with it, bring the noise, the burning, and then the learning. And so he would see not only his father, but many other people jumping pews, probably hooping, doing their thing, and he was like, yeah, I'm not really into that. I want to do something different. But then the Spirit caught up with him. Through the offices of highly intelligent, intensely cerebral, poetic and philosophically deep teachers and professors who gave him a motto of the ministry is not simply a reflex reaction to surrounding emotional data, but an intellectual engagement with the highest order of critical reflection. That God is not something simply, someone simply, a being simply, to be emotionally engaged in an ecstatic expression of what the 19th century called the frenzy, but instead God was to be engaged as a person. He would go on to write a dissertation about this, who demanded the highest order of intellectual reflection. The reason I say that, I ain't got to tell y'all that. Y'all got Dr. Judy, you got Dr. Howard, you got smart people. A lot of people in religion think, you go to school, you get ruined. Some of them, a lot more people need to be ruined, right? The choice between ignorance and enlightenment, right? You ain't necessarily evil if you got smarts, or good if you're dumb, or uninformed, or unintelligent, or ignorant, right? So that the correlation between the two, unconsciously for many, has led to a suspicion and skepticism of intellectual engagement. Now, there is a healthy skepticism toward the life of the mind. We should not make a fetish of critical consciousness. We should not worship at the altar of the intellect as the highest order of expression of humanity. Being good is better than being smart. If you can do both at the same time, that's preferable. Immanuel Kant said there's no such thing as being good without being smart. The Critique of Pure Reason, the philosophical program that he articulated, suggested that critical rationality was the predicate for moral and ethical assertion. In other words, you got to be smart to be good. And you got to be able to make reasonable and rational choices in the context of competing claims about what's good. And on the other hand, you got a lot of smart people doing some evil stuff. So how do you regulate, how do you govern morally the human being that is intensely intelligent but lacks a kind of moral and ethical center? So Martin Luther King Jr. was suspicious and skeptical of a certain kind of emotional brand of religion. But Dr. Drew and then Dr. Kelsey, who went to teach at Drew University, his name is George Kelsey, left Morehouse to teach at Drew, and then Dr. Mays, and then I think his sociology professor, Walter Chivers, and others, gave him a model of what ministry could be about. So at 19, he delivered his initial sermon. And then he went off to Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, 3 years, and then left Crozer to go to Boston University to get a PhD. And there, Dr. King wrote a dissertation comparing the conceptions of God between Henry Nelson Wyman and Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich was a professor of theology, a famous German professor, fled Nazism in Germany, came to teach in the United States, one of the most renowned professors of theology that we've had. And he believed that God was the ground of being, not a personal interaction with God. You know, not going to get up, woke up this morning with my mind. Nope. That ain't it. That's not the story. God is the basis of being, not a personal force. Remember when Einstein said God doesn't play dice with the universe? Einstein didn't believe in a personal God. How can Einstein, who's an atheist, talk about God playing a dice with the universe? What Einstein was talking about, the force that creates all existence, the structure of scientific law that is the predicate for our own universe. So for him, the structure of scientific law was the reflection of God. For Paul Tillich, God was the basis from which we drew our existence. The being that we have derives from the ground of that existence, not a personal God invested in interfering with or directing destiny through human history. Now, Henry Nelson Wyman said no, he was a personalist who believed, and I suspect many of us are personalists in here, as opposed to Tillichian ground of being. I could be wrong. I could be wrong, but when you're talking about Jesus, then you're a personalist, right? Because you believe that God bears the marks of human personality, a being who engages with human community. Now, there are many black people who are non-believers, or they're even believers, who believe more along Tillich's conception of God as the basis and predicate for human existence that is not a personal force, a personality intervening on human history. Henry Nelson Wyman said, no, God is a personal force engaged with human history. And that's very important for Martin Luther King Jr., because here he is, very sharp young man, middle class status, known as Tweed. He and his partner, 15 years old, come on, 15, 16, 17, 18. They were called the Wrecking Crew. Why, they asked Dr. King, then Martin, why are you and your friend called the Wrecking Crew? Because we wreck all the ladies. Just want to keep it real with you a little bit up in here. Dr. Dre and the Worldwide Wrecking Crew and all them, that wasn't the first one. Tweed, because he had nice clothes. So I always caution people, when you're beating up on young folk and y'all ain't like Dr. King, maybe they are, just at what stage? Tweed, nicely dressed, nattily dressed, immaculately groomed. And then, 25, 26 years old, finishing up a PhD, Boston University, a dissertation comparing the conceptions of God in Henry Nelson Wyman and Paul Tillich, and then he met Coretta Scott King, and then they had a courtship, and that was against the Negro elite conception of wife that was put forth in Atlanta. He was supposed to marry an opera singer, Sister Dobbs. That was the hookup. It wasn't arranged, but it was sure enough situationalized. Then he brought home Coretta, country girl, and she did not fit into that mold. She was poor. He was wealthy, Negro wealthy, right? Got a car for graduation from seminary. You doing better than most white folk, too. Dr. King, newly married, meeting his wife, saying, I'm like Napoleon at his Waterloo, running game on her from the first night he met her. He's spitting mad lyrics at Coretta Scott King. Now, Coretta, I'm not a player, I just crush a lot. When the Remy is in the system, ain't no, okay. So Dr. King, the first night he met Coretta Scott, is saying, you got all the attributes to be my wife. In light of the fact he didn't live that long, he had to get on about his business. Courtship, she's like, stay away, you're too short. I don't want no short man. You'd missed out on Martin. All right, ladies, I'm just saying. Looking for them tall boys, you better look at 5'7", 5'8". I have a dream. And she confessed later on, she said he was too short, and I didn't want to deal with him as a preacher, no. Right, got to get over that. Got to see who the person is. Got to see what's behind the facade. And she's drop dead gorgeous, beautiful couple. They get together, marry, then he gets a call to go south. Doesn't want to forget his people from Atlanta, goes north, outside of Philadelphia and Crozer in Chester, Pennsylvania, then on to Boston University, but the South calls him to a small church, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, but an elite church. Small but elite. Silk stocking, you know the kind. Negro elite, you know the kind. The educated Negrati, you know the kind. Everybody who's somebody went, you know the kind. And Dr. Vernon Johns was the pastor. You remember him. He was a character. Dr. Vernon Johns knew 300 German poems by heart. Right? They tried to stop him from going to school as a Negro, and they said, well, pass this test. You got to, translate this from the Greek. He did it like it was English, no problem. Translate German, did it, got into school. But he was an unorthodox preacher. Talk like this, and these Negro preachers been having you on your head preaching to your behind. I'm going to put you on your behind and preach to your head. A little bit more colorful than that, but this is PG. Oh, that's the kind of guy, well, highly intelligent, intensely cerebral, a remarkable orator, but also selling fish out the back of the church. Negroes in the silk stocking church did not dig that, right? Watermelon, he was a farmer, so to speak. And when he went places to preach, my pastor was a mentee of his and said he would show up, Dr. Johns, at the train station with a paper bag with his clothes in it. But what a genius he was. He then was Dr. King's predecessor. And now King comes along, eloquent, formally trained, minister, finishing up his PhD. And then Rosa Parks is arrested. They're trying to figure out who can be our leader. Because Rosa Parks didn't get arrested now by chance. She was looking for the opportunity to test the limits of segregation on public transportation. That ain't no, my feet was tired and I didn't want to get up, right? This denies the legitimacy, the agency that she exercised in order to test the limits. She and E.D. Nixon, head of the sleeping car, what is it? The Porters, right? The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. A. Philip Randolph. And so he was the local head of that organization. They were looking for the right opportunity. She was the secretary of the NAACP. And so they were looking for an opportunity to test the legitimacy of the law if it would hold up. And so one day when she's on the bus, she wasn't the first one. There was a young woman named Claudette Colvin, 15 years old. Y'all know her. She was pregnant, though. Now, Negroes knew that white folk, first thing they're going to say, you pregnant, get out the way. You loud and cussing, get out the way. Now, they can be loud and cussing and pregnant too, but it don't make no difference, right? If Barack Obama's daughter was pregnant versus Sarah Palin's daughter, as an example. I'm just saying, as an example. Malia and Sasha can't even make faces at the turkey. They can't even go, whatever. Okay, Dad, I know you're the president and everything, but really? That's what the people their age do. Plus, they were right, it was whack. My man got skills, but that ain't one of them. So you know how, and plus Negroes gonna judge you. Gotta be perfect. That's the vicious effect of white supremacy we internalize, right? The feeling that we have to be perfect. And I'll get to that later. Our victims have to be perfect. Michael Brown has to be perfect. Trayvon Martin gotta be perfect. You got to be perfect to be useful or a human being. Everybody makes mistakes on the way to getting where they're going. George Bush said he was drunk until he was 40. Then he became the decider. Our present president said he dabbled. And California or Colorado had not yet made it legal. Now, she wasn't the first, but she tested the law. Long story short, she's arrested. Joanne Robinson, a professor at the local school, gets on the mimeograph machine. Young people don't even know what a mimeograph machine is. Starts mimeograph. Anyone even know Xerox? I'm talking about mimeograph. Put the stencil on. Y'all remember that? With the ink and roll it around? Y'all don't know nothing about that. Young people like, what? What? What the what? The what? Then we had to run the copies off. Y'all mad if you got slow service on the Wi-Fi. If the Xerox ain't fast enough, you had to mimeograph that joint. Joanne Robinson, as women were leading the movement. Rosa Parks, hardly ever getting their due. That's why Selma's so important as a movie. So the women take the lead. E.D. Nixon challenges the preachers to step forth, and they're not. If we want to talk about race and religion, we got to talk about the ways in which several traditions within religious community have sanctioned and quarantined political matters to their own sphere, not to interact with church, God, or faith. And so Martin Luther King Jr. and his generation are challenging that very small segment. They are not the majority, do not be mistaken. But E.D. Nixon goes to the ministers, but they're hemming and hawing, and he says, you mean to tell me you take these nickels and dimes and get rich off of these washer women, but you can't stand up to represent them when it comes time? Then they called a meeting together, the Montgomery Improvement Association, its eventual name, and King was the new man in town. Other ministers were jockeying to be the head Negro in charge. They say, he's the new guy. Everybody said, let's get him. They ain't know what skills he got. You always got to be prepared. You never know what's going to happen. You got to be ready, right? And so King is chosen as the head. And you know the story. For 300 and more, 80-some days, a bus boycott goes on. King is thrust into national fame. He says, the battering rams of historical necessity, in taking a line from Reinhold Niebuhr, another great Christian ethicist, has thrust me into the limelight. 26, 27 years old. Becomes a national leader. Writes a book called Stride Toward Freedom. In Harlem signing it, and a black woman comes up to him and asks if he's Dr. King. He says yes, and plunges her letter opener into his chest. And of course, he tells a famous story that the doctors told him had he sneezed, he would have drowned in his own blood. You know, Negro preachers gonna get stories out of everything. Y'all remember, I don't know if y'all heard that last speech Dr. King gave? You know, you hear the end of it, I may not get there with you. You remember that? Well, how he starts that speech, you need to go back and listen. That may be the greatest speech pound for pound he ever gave. At the crib, in his hotel, tired, Ralph Abernathy comes and said, this yo crowd, Doc, tonight. We can't take nobody filling in for you. He gets up, shaves, gets in a cab, comes over to the church that night, and then just drops pure science. If God will allow me to live just a few years, in the latter part of the 20th century, I will be satisfied. But he took a tour of history. And then he came down, he said, America always sang, be true to what you said on paper. Then he told the story about how he almost got killed with that letter opener. And he says, I received many letters while I was in the hospital. I got one from the president, don't remember what that said. Got one from the governor, don't remember what that said. He said, but a young woman wrote me a letter. And she said, Dear Dr. King, while it should not matter, I'm a little white girl. She said, but I read in the paper about your condition, and I'm so sorry. And I read also that had you sneezed, your aorta would have been punctured and you would have drowned in your own blood. And I just simply want to say, I'm so happy you didn't sneeze. Now, you know he worked that out right there. If I had sneezed, wouldn't have been around here in 1961. Man, go listen to that sermon. That's like the Blueprint, maybe the Black Album, maybe Illmatic. Together. And so, Dr. King, punctured, stabbed, new leader, loses his way, trying to figure out what to do, finding a movement. Then the Freedom Rides in 1961, Birmingham in 1963, Albany before, and then Selma. All of this is to suggest that Martin Luther King Jr., of course, is not a solo gunslinger. He is being shaped in the crucible of his own religious belief about the relationship between race and religion and politics and culture and God. Many of us try to divorce them, to keep them distinct. Martin Luther King Jr. understood that the church must become politically evolved and involved. The church cannot afford to be immune to the influences of the world, even as it articulates its vision morally and ethically about the transformative power of the Spirit. He believed that God had something to say about the human condition. More specifically, race in its relationship to religion is critical. Why? Because now we got all kind of highfalutin theories about race now. Race is a social construct. You know, you go to schools, including mine, we teach you this. Race is not biologically determined. It's not phenotype and genotype. It's not chromosomes and heritability. It is about the meanings that society assigns to different people. When I used the word earlier, white supremacy, I'm talking about a system and structure of consciousness and practices that rest upon the conscious or unconscious belief that some people are inherently inferior and superior. Not individual finger pointing at white brothers and sisters. White supremacy is a methodology. It is a belief system. It is a structural reality upon which American democratic principles even rest. The birth of whiteness and the birth of America in this northern hemisphere, in the West, is intensely critical. They are interrelated. And so, in America in particular, the notion of goodness as white and badness as anything that falls outside of whiteness is the basis for the assignment of privilege, even in the political order. You had to be a property-owning white male in order to be recognized as a duly sworn citizen of our compact. They reading John Locke, they reading Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, all the founding fathers are articulating their conceptions. We hold these truths to be self-evident. These are philosophical ideas that are articulated in a political moment to found the nation. The nation is founded upon principles of democratic engagement, which rest upon racial hierarchy. What do I mean by racial hierarchy? Some folk are better than others. Some folk got more stuff than others. And they bring God into it too, to co-sign their bigotry. Now, we do the same thing, just about different issues. I don't even want to go, that ain't my lecture. But you know what I'm saying, right? Supreme Court said they're going to decide it. You know what case I'm talking about. So, when you talk about America, and you talk about race, and you talk about religion, from the very beginning, the founding of the nation is ineluctably tied to white supremacy. White supremacy is the conscious or unconscious belief in a certain inherent superiority or inferiority of some, inherent superiority of whiteness, and the inherent inferiority of everything that falls outside of the pale of whiteness. Whiteness and American identity are coterminous. That just means they came together. And if they're coterminous, they grew up together, whiteness and Americanness are sealed. That's why even today, when you see the birthers challenging Obama, that is the echo of historic legacies of white supremacy articulated in the modern moment. I'm going to talk about that next week. Just a preview. And so when we think about this, religion gets involved as well. Many white Christians believe that God saved black savages from Africa to bring them here to America to redeem them. That's why some folk got a problem with your religion. Because God was made to co-sign. Here we are in our own generation and era looking at Muslim brothers and sisters and thinking Islam is itself so radically problematic and evil. Well, when we look at forces of terror, the Ku Klux Klan did not burn a crescent and a star. They burned a cross. Christian terror, the denial and renunciation of the legitimacy of the humanity of people who were not white, the skepticism of black humanity, the doubt of black intelligence are part and parcel of what it means to be under the regime of white supremacy, not as individually ascribed to white brothers and sisters, but the collective agency of a culture as expressed in its political ideals. So religion from the get-go in America is tied up with the nation, and the nation is tied up with racial hierarchy. When we say race is not biologically given, look, the anthropologists have already told us race is based upon who you can, in a heterosexual paradigm, interact with, intermarry, and have children. So if y'all all can do that, y'all are the same race, the human race. But our divisions have come into play, the African, the Mongoloid, and the Caucasoid, right? The three large separations of groups based upon anthropological data and estimation of human communities. So my point is, race ain't got no biological phenomena connected to it. It's what society has made of it. And so religion is indebted to race and politics, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. Folk come to church, I ain't got nothing to do with that. I'm about Jesus and his power and what he can do with the Holy Ghost. All that is involved ultimately in the structures of consciousness that have been given to you by dominant paradigms of intelligence and what was desirable in American Western Christianity. You ain't exempt from that. You just not conscious of it. And so when we talk about race and religion, people think, oh my God, you're intervening upon our natural order, our organic community that rests upon transcending race. But what we understand, as Malcolm X says, we are victims of democracy, which means we're victims of certain practices and principles and presuppositions that have been given to us philosophically in America. Why is all that important? Martin Luther King Jr. stood and spoke against that. When Martin Luther King Jr. stood as an ordained minister with a PhD, wasn't honorary. I ain't mad. I'm not mad. I'm a little testy. I'm not mad. Everybody doctor, I ain't mad. But I'm saying, like, for those of us who earned it, I'm not mad. I call you Doc, oh, what's up, Doc? What's up? What's up? But I'm just saying, if you're going to get funky about it, I mean, earned. And you know, I love famous black people get honorary degree and they start calling themselves doctor. That ain't how it go. That ain't really how it go. They ain't, you know, just go. I got several honorary doctorates. But I ain't gonna call myself Dr. Dyson because I got an honorary doctorate. Now, some people deserve it. You can have a BA degree, but you that much of a genius. Call you doctor 5 times. Doctor ain't about an elite status. It don't make you no better than nobody else. But it's amazing to me, people be anti-intellectual and then lusting for the credential at the same time. If you saw Blackish the other day, do you watch Blackish? When she was talking about Dr. King, and she's a medical doctor. She was like, I'm just saying, if you have a heart attack, Dr. King will give you a speech, I will give you CPR. Now that's funny. Crazy, but funny. Earned PhD. Got to go to school for it. Got to study hard for it. That man stood in the gap in America as an exemplar of the repudiation of white supremacy, of the strategic intervention in the name of black religious ethics. The black church was critical to the formation of Dr. King's consciousness. Listening to William Holmes Borders and Martin Luther King Jr. Sr. and the great Gardner Taylor. Don't know if you've heard Gardner Taylor. God saves us not by flattering us, but by opposing us. One of the greatest preachers ever, arguably in the history of Christendom. Now in his mid to late 90s, living in North Carolina. Martin Luther King Jr. then grew up in a church, got highly educated, but used his intelligence as an arsenal and artillery against white supremacy and political domination and erosion of the humanity of black people, and the redemption of America in the crucible of his struggle to not only help black folk, but to reorganize the logic of American democracy. He paid a price for it too. We'll talk a bit about this in the second half. The man was basically clinically depressed. People don't want to talk about that. I've written a couple books on Dr. King. The second one, April 4 of 1968, where I spent a great deal talking about his depression. Taboo. We really want to talk about mental health. Now, why wouldn't he be depressed? He's trying to talk, and people trying to kill him every day. Every day. Now, I don't know if you've ever had any death threats. I have. I'm sure many of you have. Now, and for real death threats, not no fake ones. Like your girlfriend mad and she... Until you do right by me. Right, so baby mama, I'll kill you. Not that, I'm talking about real ones. Although she could be real too, be careful. I'm talking about for real. Like, one of the times I got death threat, I had written a book on Cosby 10 years ago. Oh, thanks for catching up. And the people said, I ain't gonna go there, but you know what I'm saying. Black people, I'm saying, you wanna shoot me over Jell-O pudding pop? FBI called me up and said, we got a legitimate death threat against you. I had to have bodyguards at the book signing because I'm trying to question the assault upon poor black people of a comedian who calls himself Dr. Cosby because he got an EDD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Somebody wrote the dissertation. And that's in the record. I'm not hating. I'm relating the facts. And allegedly, ostensibly, let me say that. And people got upset because I challenged him long before the alleged activities of recent days. It was enough to call black people out of their names and ignominious, slanderous assaults upon their identity. Already that was wrong. You name your kids Shaniqua, Talika, and Muhammad and all that crap, and they're all in jail. He says, you have a baby at 15, the baby has a baby when you're 16. He says, you grow up, you might be making love to your grandmother. Oh, right. But people go, no, that's just like my uncle in the barbershop. Let Mr. Cosby alone. You don't know what Mr. Cosby was saying about people that reinforce white supremacist values and beliefs about poor black people to start with. All I'm saying is, you get a death threat, you be like something else. You big and bad and brave, but you know, window open, who they at? Where they at? Let me hear him get his lecture. Look, I was gonna talk a long time, I'm just say, look, Bill Cosby's wrong, I'm right, good, let's sign. It's all good, it's all good. You ever had a real death threat? Still gotta speak, still gotta talk, still have to deliver. So not only is he taking on the bulwark of white supremacy, not only is he arguing against the belief in America that we should quarantine religion to the margin, not only he's arguing against black people's belief, the majority of whom thought that this civil rights stuff should be something outside of the sanctuary. Black religion is at the heart of Dr. King's vision. Race and religion are tied together, yoked together, because your conception of God is related to the community in which you are reared, the womb of religion that births you, the imagination with which you are gifted is colored by your social situation and your existential roots in a particular domestic space. And so Dr. King, understanding that, warred against those practices and principles based upon his faith. Death threat every day. You could hear it in his voice. And I'm happy to be happy. His happy was sad. As Dr. Gardner Taylor said, there was a great tear in his voice. Robustly unique, symphonic voice, beautiful euphonious voice, rising to the heights. And yet the devastation and death that he constantly engaged left him clinically depressed. Why wouldn't he be? The FBI trying to wipe him out? The fringe, lunatic bigots trying to murder him? Black middle class skeptical of him? Black religious formations keeping him in arm's distance? Dr. King left the National Baptist Convention along with Dr. Gardner Taylor and others to form the Progressive National Baptist Convention because the National Baptist Convention was deeply and profoundly conservative, and those ministers did not see the relationship between race and religion, between politics and culture, between politics and religion, between the church and society. So Martin Luther King Jr. was the exemplar of that, standing in his church, preaching Sunday in and Sunday out. And what a great preacher he was. This man, then, is the figure we celebrate, but in the few minutes I have left in this part, he's not the figure who is the radical figure he became that we remember. Martin Luther King Jr. after Selma. We're going to talk about Selma in the second part. After Selma, shifted gears and started talking about economic inequality. Began to speak about the embrace of democratic socialism in private, and in public began to talk about the tyranny of the triplets of evil: racism, militarism, and poverty. At the end of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. owned maybe 2-3 suits. Tweed, 2 or 3 suits. When he won the Nobel Peace Prize, as you saw open the Selma movie, $54,000. Now, back in '63, that was dough. That's dough now. At one lump sum, if you 54,000, that's good money. Tremendous money. Gave it all to the movement. Real conflict with Coretta at the crib over that. Just want to be real with you. Now, Martin, she wanted him to put away $5 grand. Why wouldn't he? For each one of his kids. Because you ain't got no dough. You got to, he said, no. The money belongs to the movement. That's tough. Sounds good to us, but if you at the crib and you the wife, and you ain't seeing no money come in, you out there speaking and preaching and might get killed, and we ain't got no life insurance, and you ain't got no way to pay for the kids' education. Now, that's not my money. Right? That's tension at the crib. Then your best friend, I don't know what you're going to do with I need half. Ralph Abernathy, I needs half. I'm out there with you. They can mistakenly shoot me. I'm just keeping it real. I know y'all don't know. I'm just making it real for you. They go over to Norway. He want to ride up there with King. He want to be riding shotgun. I'm up here because he wanted the limelight too. See? Ed McMahon want to shine with Johnny Carson. That's for the old people. I know y'all young people. Huh? What? What? Mace wants to get down with Diddy too. Okay, I'm just. So, he's got troubles at the crib because he gave the money. I'm not trying to paint her. She's got a reason to be salty. Like a lot of them. The movie deals with that. I'll talk about that later. So, she's at the crib in a house that he refuses to buy for them personally because he didn't believe in the ownership of personal property. He went to India, visited Nehru. He didn't believe that people should own personal property. She forced him to finally buy a house in 1965, I believe it was, and it was in the hood. Right? That's the kind of conscience he had. He made over $200,000 a year then, and gave every dime except $10,000 to the movement. Had to borrow money routinely from his daddy to pay his taxes. This is the prophet. Morehouse College refused to put him on its board until 2.5 years before he died. Why? Because the white chairman of the board, Mr. Lynch, it's Merrill Lynch, you know, Merrill, Brother Merrill, said that King was a poor role model. Why is that? He went to jail too often. He wasn't selling crack. He gave every dime from his royalties from his books to his alma mater. This man lived at the depths of his being a commitment that was complete and total because his understanding of God was of a demanding relationship to his own religious community, more broadly to his racial community, and more broadly to the American social compact. Martin Luther King Jr. was indeed one of the great prophets in human history. He was a prophet because he lived the life he sang about in his song. He was not perfect, as we know. He was a flawed human being, as we all are, and yet, despite that, he rendered service. You don't have to be perfect to be useful. And those who were after him, J. Edgar Hoover, sent, as you saw in the film, the recording to his wife. It's hard enough to stay married without the government trying to kill your marriage. I'm just saying, I don't know if y'all can testify. It's hard just by yourself. Ain't nobody messing with you. You want bologna? No, I want sausage. Your toothpaste is messed up. You don't pick up after you. It's just hard without nobody messing with you. But when the government is trying to subvert your marriage, the difficulties are exponentially increased. This is the man, depressed, struggling with his own finitude, human being in the midst of extraordinarily difficult circumstances, who rose to become our Moses and to tell the truth about our suffering. Martin Luther King Jr. was a great American prophet for a few reasons, and I'll name a few. First of all, because he insisted on rooting his religious truth inside the context of his broader culture. Why is that important? Because he demanded that the centrality of his faith be acknowledged as the basis for his identity. He was a preacher, and he understood that. He was a Baptist preacher, and he embraced that. And that meant he had certain moral, philosophical, and ethical commitments to truth-telling that could not be compromised by the seductions of the broader society. And yet, he insisted upon relating his conception of God as a just God who transforms human community to the dominant society. Now, the reason that's important, you got a lot of folk came after Dr. King, the right wing and stuff. We're just like Dr. King. No, you ain't. A lot of those people are trying to make this a Christian nation. Dr. King used his Christian identity and his vision to make this a just nation. That's a big difference. Because just because it's Christian don't mean it's right. Because Dr. King said, I go by these churches and I see those, I wonder, what God are you worshiping? You're lynching people, you're involved with all kind of nefarious activities. You will not stand up for those who are vulnerable. So that's critical. Number two, he used every bit of his intellectual firepower to argue against the practices of social injustice. Now, a lot of us use our time and resources for a lot of stuff. Ain't no harm trying to get paid, trying to get a better house, bigger car, bigger bank accounts, beautiful. But the end of life, the goal, is not simply to win with the biggest toys or the greatest amount, but to render service by virtue of your gifts. And his great gift was the ability to articulate for those who could not otherwise speak. Remember, Jesse Jackson told me the story that Dr. King was doing his thing one day. You know, he'd be throwing them words around. He said, God, I believe that God is love. Yes. I believe that God is the basis of our existence. Yes. I believe that God is the ontological affirmation of our ultimate assertion as human beings. Yes. And then somebody said, you don't even know what he said. He said, yeah, but the white folk don't either. He used his intellectual credential to defend the vulnerable. And then finally, what makes him a prophet was the relentless evolution of his self-understanding and his understanding of the world. The relentless evolution of his self-understanding and his understanding of the world. What do I mean by that? The king of I Have a Dream is not the king of the mountaintop speech. He evolved. This king concluded that most Americans are unconscious racists. You won't see that on a Burger King commercial celebrating the dream. He moved from a dream metaphor to narrating the impossible nights that we all had to confront. And he talked about his dream turning into a nightmare when those 4 little girls were murdered. He spoke about the tragic renunciation of the principles of nonviolence in his own government. He said that America was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He spoke out against the war in Vietnam. He was a prophet because he was evolving in his awareness of himself. And he said, you wouldn't find my name in those who were the profiles in courage, but I began to wrestle with my conscience. And his wife and Stokely Carmichael and James Bevel, among others, forced him into an awareness that he had to link what he felt about race to what he felt about militarism. And what he felt about race and militarism, he had to link to poverty. This name it and claim it theology, this prosperity gospel that rests upon an explicit repudiation of the radical identification of God with the victims of history and economic inequality, would have rubbed the wrong way. 4 months, maybe 4 weeks before he died, as I end, the Ford Foundation sponsored a conference on black ministers, and he said some of you are more concerned about the size of your wheelbase on your automobile than about justice for your congregation and those who are poor. This relentless evolution of self-understanding and understanding his place in the world made him a unique, irresistible, charismatic figure who embodies the best values of black Christianity and the prophetic faith to which all of us must challenge ourselves to be committed.